Hey everybody, KC here. So today, as promised, I have part one of my conversation with Benjamin Lorr. Ben is the author of the new book, The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. And let me tell you, I found this book to be absolutely fascinating. He's come at the subject, both the grocery store and basically the supply chain that makes it possible, with some really interesting insights and from some really provocative angles. So I think you'll really enjoy it. Full disclosure, about 5 years ago, I got a call from Ben, and I did not know him. And he told me what he was thinking about doing. And we talked a few times, exchanged some emails. I made some suggestions of people who are a lot smarter than I am that he could talk to. And I got to be honest, at the time I said to myself, how's he going to get a book out of this? Well, let me tell you something. He got a book out of this. I totally suggest you read it. So, and now part one of my conversation with Benjamin Lorr. Benjamin Lorr, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Hey, total pleasure to be here. It's good to see you.
I have to start, go back to the very beginning. Your last book was about yoga. What was it about the supermarket business that grabbed your attention a long time ago? You put an enormous amount of time into this book.
That's a great question. So my last book was on the Bikram yoga world, which is something like a quasi cult within the yoga world. And really got fascinated by the connection that people had, the glue that kind of stuck them to this yoga. And during a training that I attended for that book, I watched all these yogis get out of the training and run to a Trader Joe's with like a maniacal glee that I just hadn't seen. And there just seemed to be something analogous in that stickiness and that connection that I thought was really interesting. And kind of compounding that, over the course of my life, which is a relatively short life, food has just gone through a shift. When I was growing up, you go to the store and food was food. And now food is like this property of identity, whether it's showing like how fit you are, your connection to your kin or your ancestors, or your ecological consciousness. And so seeing that stickiness and that shift in food, I thought was something that I wanted to learn more about. And the grocery store seemed like the entry point to get into it.
It was interesting. At one point in the book, you make a reference to, I guess, three different kinds of taste, right? There's the taste that you have on your palate. There's the taste that you demonstrate by what you choose. And then there's also sort of the taste that you illustrate to other people by what you choose. It's the old story about, I can remember somebody telling me years ago that, people who drank Coca-Cola saw themselves as Coke drinkers, and people who saw themselves as Pepsi drinkers saw themselves as Pepsi. They identified with the brand values, identity, whatever that happened to be. So it didn't matter how many taste tests they took. There were Coke people and there were Pepsi people, and people. So right, whether you shop at Trader Joe's or you shop at Ralph's or you shop at Publix, you identify with that experience.
Yes. One of the big take home for me was just how much a reflection of ourselves individually our retailing choices are, but also aggregate as a society. The reflection might not be pretty, and in some points in the book it gets pretty ugly, but how much that retail reflection tacks back to choices that people are making and demands that they're making, whether it's for convenience and abundance and low price all at the same time, these seemingly disparate values. So thinking about what that like taste in terms of social discernment really means, I thought was fascinating. And one of those things that, in the book, I think I talk to or about an anthropologist who did this study on people's choices when they're making clothing decisions. And most people don't find out whether they like a outfit that they're wearing until after they wear it in front of someone else. Like the moment of deciding this is an outfit that fits you well isn't like when you're trying it on in the dressing room by yourself. it's after you wear it for someone else and they give you feedback on it. And then you come to fall in love with this thing that you might have already purchased. And so thinking about all the different ways that our taste is socially constructed, and then what that means for food and what that means for buying habits. I don't know. I thought that was just a fascinating world.
Was there a working premise that you went in with that either was validated or challenged by what you found?
That's a great question. I think in one level, I tried to steer clear of a big working premise, because I didn't know anything about the grocery world starting this. Um, but on another level, I was suspicious of the current foodie dogma. I think I grew up with these books, like Michael Pollan and Eric Schlosser were gods of nonfiction to me. But in many ways, the narrative that has come from them is that there are these big, greedy, faceless, nameless corporations that are controlling your life and feeding you plastic products. And well, there's a lot of truth to that critique, and I don't want to undermine that critique. It just didn't seem logical for the grocery store, which has these thin margins. If you're talking 1.5% to 3.5% margins, it doesn't make sense that there would be this top-down control over prices. So I think I wanted to test out that hypothesis about like demand side control and where people were active agents in creating the world that they're living in as consumers, as opposed to the kind of passive just takers of what this machine is pumping out.
Well, and one of the things that I know you talk about in the book, and it might be a little inside baseball for most consumers, but I think they ought to know it. For the God knows I write about it all the time, is the whole notion of slotting allowances and promotional fees and things like that, and how they dictate to a great degree what we see in the store and what we're able to buy. At one point, quote, a morning newsbeat, a favorite and a friend of mine, Glenn Terbeek, who talks about the fact, that if you took all of the promotional allowances, and this is back when he wrote his book, Age of Your Agenda 20 years ago, if you took all those promotional allowances and failure fees, they added up to basically all the profit in the industry,
right.
which is bizarre, but I don't know how. I think that's probably relatively true even today.
Oh, and it's one of those areas where I feel like wading through to actually figure out that answer is just almost a fool's errand, because there's so much double speak in pricing and the way these fees are applied and trade spend is applied, that how you would ever get to a concrete answer there is mystifying to me. But the impression I got from talking to people is that, yeah, it's as more than ever. I mean, he wrote that book in the late 80s or
no, I think
late 90s.
98, something.
Yeah, okay, late 90s. But yeah, I mean, it just seemed like he was really onto something way ahead. And that was just, again, that's one of these things that I think as a consumer walking into these stores, you have a complete misapprehension of how it's functioning. You don't think of the supermarket as a landlord. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think, there are consequences of that, but there's nothing morally wrong with that. It changes which products get to shelf. And it means that if you're a young entrepreneur and you're struggling, like the gamble is a lot higher. It means that things that are connected to venture funding and have resources are going to be able to catapult over barriers that trip a lot of people up.
As in life, it's not just the supermarket, right? I mean,
it always helps to have venture funding
everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that you just don't get that understanding of that as a consumer pushing your cart down, that this is a curated selection of items based not necessarily on flavor profile and not necessarily on the qualities that you value, but qualities that the store values, like shelf life, like ability to pony up for some trade spend.
And remarkably, and again, not to get too far down the rabbit hole, very often not keyed to what people in a given market happen to like or eat, right? even though they have the data to be able to look at that, retailers often are not examining the data to that kind of an extent, so that a store in this market is dramatically different than a store in another market.
Yes.
They're not customizing those stores based on what consumers want to the degree that they probably should or would in a perfect world.
And could, now that the data is available. There's really no excuses for it now. I mean, that's not in the book, but it's kind of like an off record impression I got, was just this generational divide between, and not just generational, but like technological divide between up and coming retailers that are like internet based and data based, and old school retailers who just aren't fluid in making those choices and aren't connected to the kind of pulse and really operate as kind of replenishment of procurement channels that they have established long ago, and are taking kind of a lazier approach as opposed to really listening to what people want, and actually creating ways to listen, because you can't just listen to data. You have to like make sure you're getting the right type of data and making sure it's connected to people. But yeah,
you do write in the book about Amazon. I mean, you talk a little bit about and Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, and
yeah,
sort of, basically the premise is that while some people will say that Whole Foods has lost a step up its game since being acquired by Amazon, the implication of the book is that was happening anyway.
yes. I think Whole Foods had, they were getting beat up by a lot of different forces, including Wall Street as a publicly traded company and the whole paycheck kind of moniker. So they were in this desperate, like looking over their shoulder, how do we lower price and how do we do that? I think they decided we centralize buying and we bring a lot of this stuff in, and we, kind of shift away from the local image that really created that chain and created a lot of its power originally. So yeah, that was, I think, well in the making before Amazon. With Amazon, they found a partner, of course, who does that to the nth degree, and so I think it becomes a little bit more shocking for the consumer who thinks of like the Whole Foods halo of wholesomeness and win-win partnerships, and those are just not the things you associate with Amazon, rightly so.
Yeah, I listen. I mean, nothing makes me crazier than when people say, "Oh, Whole Foods was so wonderful and so pure and so successful," and then they got bought by Amazon, and it's like, well, if they were that successful, Amazon would not have been able to buy them. I mean,
Yes.
They were in trouble when Amazon bought them. They were
And they
going down the road anyway.
Yeah, and I think in many ways they were a victim of their own success. They didn't figure out how to turn the corner. They pioneered all these products that have gone hugely mainstream, and they nurtured them often from a very local level. They walked into Whole Foods, regional place, and they did waive trade spend and things to let them on shelf. And then they got big, and they jumped over to places like Target once they got big, and then Whole Foods regional structure that nurtured them wasn't able to adapt to that, and they never kind of turned the corner on like, how do we continue to be the best at and show off that we're the best at this local slash wholesome ecological wholesomeness, and then I guess they walked away from that.
And you put that to rest pretty early in the book, because you're talking about working actually at the fish counter in a Whole Foods, and you describe the smell of the cleaning experience in a way that is, I can only say, is a little stomach wrenching. and then you compared it to all these other smells and said, and this is worse.
It was a gross smell. I am someone who I am comfortable with life and all the various odors. And I think there was something about, one, the fact I had worked at that fish counter for a few weeks at that point when we cleaned the case, and I hadn't noticed anything. So I think for me, most of all, it works just as a metaphor for this kind of stench that's buried and beneath the retail surface. But it was something.
You're clearly fascinated with Trader Joe's to a degree that surprised me reading the book, because I think of Trader Joe. I mean, you see it as seem to see it as a reflection of a lot of things in the industry. I tend to see Trader Joe's as more of an anomaly, maybe less so now than it used to be, but still an anomaly. It just does things differently. Am I misreading that?
No, no. Well, I think you're reading it right. Your only thing you're misreading is that I think it's an anomaly too.
Oh, okay.
And if anything, it was a frustrating from just a writing perspective. So I got all this great access to Trader Joe, the founder, and some early employees of his. So I really got a sense of the decisions they were making. And I knew, again, my entry point to this whole book was these like maniacal yogis descending on a Trader Joe. So it was in many ways my entry point to the world. But then as soon as I got into it, I started realizing, oh, no, Trader Joe's exists in opposition to a lot of these values. They do things completely different and in ways that aren't really helpful in understanding how the independent chain in the Midwest is making its decisions. And yet it was compelling material. So do I place that up front where you get this maybe erroneous impression that I'm signaling that it is how the rest of the world functions? Or do I use it, figuring out how to place that actually was a difficult writing decision. But no, I completely agree. I think it exists as in opposition to the forces we were just talking about. Like I think Trader Joe and Amazon, Whole Foods are, and I say Trader Joe, not Trader Joe's, because I do think the chain has changed since his kind of design blueprint in the 70s and 80s. But they exist as opposites. Like one is kind of nurturing human curiosity, and one is, buying for people. And almost in the way you hear of like Steve Jobs and Amazon designing products and then waiting for the audience to create it. Well, I think Trader Joe was doing that earlier than Steve Jobs. In a very same way for food, and that's just Amazon is not operating under that.
Well, I mean, even to this day, and I forget exactly how many SKUs they have in a Trader Joe's, but let's say it's 2,500. Let's say that's the number. I mean, I think to this day they're so disciplined that they will not go above that number. So if you want to bring something in, you have to find something else that's going to go.
Yeah.
Which is unusual discipline for a lot of retailers where SKU proliferation takes place to the point where they go, oh my God, how do we end up with that many items in the store, and aren't disciplined enough necessarily to figure out what they need to get rid of.
Yeah, and talking to Trader Joe, he really framed that to a large extent as humanism and the humility that his buyers simply couldn't master a world where they were expected to, be dealing with 50,000 SKUs instead of a world that was more manageable, small scale, and would allow them to get expertise in those products. And I think it really pays off in the type of products he was stocking, especially at that time, that were these unique finds that involved actually private labeling something in not just a in name only, but like a bona fide tweak that would create value.
That's it for part one. Tomorrow, part two.